And we've got a great panel. I will introduce them in a second. But first of all, let me just set the scene for you. Every single person in this room over 25 years old, and I know that Joan is going to take issue with my description, but every single person in this room over 25 suffers from a disease. And that disease is the disease of aging. And eventually, aging is going to kill us. Now, there are associated diseases of aging, such as cancer and heart attacks and diabetes and lung disease and so forth. But ultimately, aging is a thing that will kill us. And, but the aging is not regarded in scientific circles yet as a unitary disease. But when it is, a lot of money, and it's beginning to happen now, will flow into the science of longevity and anti-aging from academic institutions, from corporations, and from governments, because surely the concept of a much longer life, which is what's going to happen, and I'm researching a book on this subject at the moment, is one that almost everyone in this room can embrace. But it's very hard for people to believe that they're going to live to over 100, but the stats show that you probably are. Most of the people in this room will live to over 100 years old, given our backgrounds and our economic situation and so forth. Andrew Scott, who's at the end here, has written a book called The 100-Year Life. And I told him, rather jokingly earlier on, that he's going to have to revise that in the second edition to the 120 or 130-year-old life. And that is going to change everything in the world. It's going to change the trajectory of our lives, the social contract that we have at the moment, where we go to school at 5 and we finish at 18, we go to university, some of us at least, and we go to work till we're 65 years old, and then we wait, in the case of the average American, for another 16 or 17 years before we die, and we leave the workforce at 65 years old on average. That whole contract is going to be changed, and it's going to have massive implications for the economy and for society as a whole. And my research into this subject has suggested to me very strongly that it's entirely possible that the average life expectancy of people on this planet will rise in the next 10 to 20 years to about 110 because of the technology that already exists. And that if you can make it that far, there will surely be new technologies, including genetic engineering and the manipulation of biological processes, that will take us to the 150 plus year life that some scientists are suggesting, serious scientists are suggesting, is possible today. But at the moment, we're still trapped in the old ways. And as you probably know, Bismarck was the first person to introduce a pension in the 1890s in Germany. And it was for people over 65 years old. And at that time, less than 1% of the population lived above 65. So it wasn't a great big burden on the state to pay that pension. But today, in the United States, you already have a very high proportion of people over 60 years old, and that proportion is going to double in the next 20 years or so. The number of centenarians is ballooning. In the United Kingdom, it was 1 in 1917. That's true, one person was over 100. And now it's 16,000. And by 2020, we're going to have over 50,000 centenarians in the UK. So the whole path of life is changing. But companies and organizations have not yet taken that into account. And that's the reason for our panel today. We're going to talk about the economic opportunities, and we're going to talk about the societal implications of this huge increase in average lifespans. But the one thing we're not going to talk about is the opportunities in investing in biotech or the companies that are involved in trying to expand lifespan. We're talking about the goods and services that are associated around a longer lifespan. So I have on my the extreme right here, Chip Conley, who...
Called on the extreme right, but that's okay. Guy from San Francisco, he doesn't get that very often.
Extreme left, rather.
Okay.
And he's with Airbnb. And I thought it was rather funny when I initially saw the panel that we'd have someone from Airbnb talking about longevity, but he's got some really interesting things to say about the business model for Airbnb as it relates to people getting older, and also what's happening within Airbnb, where currently only 6% of the workforce is over 50 years old, but they're making every effort to increase that percentage and to use elder wisdom to improve the company. And then I've got Joe Coughlin, who's right next to me, who's a professor at MIT, head of the AgeLab there, and he's going to talk about specific services and goods that are being developed for the older population, and that older population gets ever bigger as a percentage of the overall population in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's
did you put Boston and San Francisco next to each other? Is that it?
Well, yeah, I didn't do the seating plan, and I'm not getting into politics, especially given the febrile atmosphere around here at the moment. And on my extreme left, I have a fellow Brit, Andrew Scott, who's professor at the London Business School and very famous in the field of longevity. His book, The 100-Year Life, written with Linda Grafton, has been a runaway bestseller, and it's definitely recommendable to everyone in this room to read. And he's going to talk about some of the research that he's undertaken into this field in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And he's got some really interesting things to say. And not least, I've got Joan Ruff to my left, who is the chair of the AARP, which is the big organization for retired people in America. It's as
50 plus.
50 plus, sorry. Okay, all right. Non-retired plus retired people. And it has 38 million members, all right? So it's basically the size of Spain. So I've got really a president next to me of a country. And furthermore, it's got $3 billion, $3 billion in reserves. So it's a pretty, we're going to be coming around and finding ways to spend that money in the future. But and I can tell you that there are some conflicting, respectful but conflicting opinions on this panel. And I'm going to try and draw them out. But the first thing I want to ask is each of the panelists, if they can describe to me what they think is the benefit of having more people who are older in the workforce, in specific companies or in organizations or in whatever, to keep people beyond the retirement years, the date at the moment, which is 65 on average, and keep them further into their working lives. And at what age do you think retirement will take place in 10 or 20 years' time? Chip, can I ask you to?
Sure, I'll focus on two different areas, and I'll be brief with both. One is on the side of Airbnb hosts. So our fastest growing demographic globally of hosts is people over 50, for obvious reason. I mean, it was actually a small base to start with. That's how math works. But the other piece is over 80% in the US, over 80% of people over 50 own their own home. And generally speaking, the best way to describe it is if you're an empty nester and you've got a 3 or 4 bedroom home and you're going to live 10 or 20 years longer than you thought you were going to live, all of a sudden the idea of monetizing space, and you don't want to leave your home, monetizing space is a very reputable, at least in some neighborhoods, a reputable idea in terms of what you could do as a means of building a retirement income. So, and interestingly enough, they are Airbnb hosts who are 50 or older have the highest guest satisfaction ratings of any demographic. On the employee side, what's fascinating as a modern, I call myself a modern elder. I joined Airbnb at age 52. My background is for 30 years as a hotelier, started a boutique hotel company, grew it, sold it, and then all of a sudden I'm asked by the 3 founders to join them because they had nobody in the company with a hospitality or travel background. So I joined at age 52 and realized quite quickly I didn't understand the language or the lingo. I lived in the tech capital of the world, but I'd never worked in tech. And my education the last 4 years has been to learn that I'm both a mentor and an intern at the same time. And I think that the interesting thing about the workplace and what we will see moving forward beyond my experience at Airbnb is that the average age of a leader in a company is declining, meaning power is moving younger for all kinds of reasons, not just in the technology field, but just in general. And yet these people who are getting more experience and more power younger don't have a lot of training, nor do they have the people with gray hair around to help give them some advice. So the number one thing I've experienced has been that tech is known to be very focused on youth because youth understands technology, but the balance to that is the wise elder, the modern elder, who can actually help with emotional intelligence, good thinking around strategy, and generally speaking, be not a competitor to the person who's 20 years younger than them who uses them as a sounding board.
That's very interesting, but you only have 6% of your workforce that's over 50 plus, as I understand it, whereas the average in America is 25%. So what are you doing specifically to increase that percentage?
You know, I think by me standing up and having a few other senior people in the company stand up and say, we're older and we're in tech, it's a first step. There are very few, I don't know any company in any industry, including tech, that actually has an affinity group for people 50 plus. We have affinity group for women in the organization, for LGBTQ, for people of color. At Airbnb, we have veterans, and we have family, parents, but we actually don't even have a group that says, we're 50 plus, how do we speak up and have a voice? So we're doing that. We're in the process of actually building the sense of how can a group in an organization where the average age is in the late 20s speak up as a different perspective within the organization. So I think personally that, I'll finish because we need to move on. I think that ultimately in the next couple of years what we need to see is treat elders like we treat engineers at Google. Google got 20% extra time for their engineers to work on innovation and innovation projects. Why not give elders who generally have been proven to be people who help create better teams by actually being less competitive and being able to, through emotional intelligence, help a team work up and operate better? Give them 20% extra time to help create a collegial, collaborative environment where teams work better.
Thank you. So, Joe, you're involved in developing services and ideas, innovations for the older market. What age do you think that people should consider their potential retirement as being in the future, given that we're going to live so much longer? What would you say is the likely age of retirement in, say, 30 or 40 years' time?
First off, birthdays are terrible predictors at anything, so I'm not going to give you a year because years, frankly, don't matter. It's the value that person can bring. When we think about the quote-unquote older workplace, and if we think about Andrew's work of the 100-year life, we are now looking at a workplace that will have not younger and older workers, but upwards today of 5 generations of workers under one roof. So the question is, what value will they bring at any age? A younger person who may be great on tech but has no emotional intelligence will offend the client that is paying for the corporation to be existing. And by the way, there's also this mythology that there is a long line of younger people that wish you would just get out of the way so I can have the job. Well, that is true in some fields, but the average doctor in the United States is 53. The average person in petrochemical and electrical is 57. Just when you need them most, nurses are now 52 years old. The bottom line is that we have a very lumpy workforce where we are going to need older workers, not just to do the work, but in their minds, in their desks, and in their experience are the things that client relationships are made of. Things that have legacy memory as to why did we do what we did? Why did that technology not work the first time we tried it? So the older worker does not need to make a case. The worker of any age needs to make the case as to what is their value, why are they here, and how can they make that happen across the generation and the enterprise.
Okay, and you're looking at entrepreneurship, obviously, on a daily view. Are there many entrepreneurs over the age of 50, and are they building more than just a B&B or a sort of a coffee shop? Are they building real businesses?
Well, it's funny. Well, it's funny you should say that. Are they building real businesses? Because while we have this image in our minds of a kid in a t-shirt with a software idea moving to Silicon Valley as being a real business, the fact is that half the jobs, at least in the United States, and more than half in the EU, are small businesses. So the coffee shop, the Airbnb, the grocery store, that is the real economy. And by the way, if you look at the Coughlin Center for Entrepreneurship, among the top 3 groups forming new businesses are not the kid with a hoodie going out to Silicon Valley, but women, because the future is not just gray, it is distinctly female. Women over 50 are the ones starting new businesses in entrepreneurship in the future.
And what about selling products to the elder cohort, so to speak? I mean, at the moment we think of products for older people as being sort of rubber sheets and stair lifts and walk-in baths and that sort of stuff. But what are you developing at the moment or what do you see being developed at the moment that is actually catering to the genuine needs of the older cohort, and
Well,
not the sort of, the ads in the back of magazine type stuff?
And like everyone else in Cambridge, the new Cambridge, not the old Cambridge, I've got a book coming out called The Longevity Economy. And the argument that I'd like to make here, as well as we make in the book, is that it's not about needs. And by the way, anyone who wants to set out and build an old man's product, you're done on arrival. Because the adage that we had from the auto industry was, guess what? A young man will never buy an old man's car, or a young woman, but guess what? A older man and an older woman will run with her hair, sorry, both of us in that category, will run with her hair on fire away from it as well. The idea is to create products and services that excite and delight. And what I'd like to say to this primarily industry and business audience is that the reason why older adults are not buying your products is not because they're old, not because they're declining in their interest in years. We have yet to invent a longevity that is worth buying. From 0 to 67, every part of your life has been specced out. How many glasses you buy for the kitchen, the type of house you want, the car you drive. After age 67, there's nada imagination. The new business, the new opportunity of longer life is not just about years, it's new markets, new experiences, and frankly, increased sales.
Fantastic. So, Joan, and earlier on you said that the spending power of the 50-plus cohort was about $7 trillion a year in the United States, which is a very substantial sum. I think it's like 1/3 of the total GDP of the United States. What do you see as being the opportunities for corporations in terms of selling products to older people? What do you see as the key industries?
Okay, first of all, let me make a correction or an add-on to definition of aging. And why I say aging is not a disease. Aging is a fact of life. From the moment you're born until you die, you're aging. So the important thing is, from my perspective, it is looking at how do you lead the best life possible, how do you recognize what is going to happen down the long, what your longevity is. It goes for millennials as well as those of us who are 50 plus, and then how do you make the best use of it. The other quick thing is on the reserves for AARP. A lot of our reserves are based in pension plans because we are one of the few organizations that still has a very vital pension plan. Again, part because of the need, as we've recognized, of that three-legged stool or four-legged stool. So now to the products. Yes, $7.1 trillion in economic activity annually in the 50-plus group. That is a lot of money. It is projected to go in 2032 up to almost $14 trillion, which would make the economic worth and the power of the 50-plus group greater than the economic power of most countries other than the United States and China. So it is something that has tremendous opportunities. So what do we look at as the kind of products and services people want? You know, as we've done a lot of research at AARP, in addition to what their wants are and their needs are, you have several cohorts of people. You have those who are, say, 80 plus, and 85 and above is the fastest growing demographic right now. And then you have those who may be 50 to 70, 75, or 80. What they want and need is things that really go to enjoying life, to making their life easier. Many people have caregiving issues, either with their parents, or some even with their kids and their grandparents or with their spouses. So that becomes very important. How do I make being able to be maybe even a long distance caregiver easier? For example, let me just tell you a quick thing. I know that when my mother had full-time care, and I was her financial caregiver 200 miles away, she lived in a small town. And so from that standpoint, it's very difficult to get people who really are caregivers in rural areas. And I think that's a totally different demographic area too that needs to be looked at. Fraud is a big issue with older individuals. So the people who in fact were taking care of my mother on a full-time basis were taking her down to the local bank And she would be drawing out a lot of funds every single day. So in this case, it was a situation where the banker called me. And this comes down to the fact that in a small town, they knew me, they knew my mother, and we got together and figured out how do we make sure that this doesn't happen by actually setting up different bank accounts of which I had the ability, I was going to write all the checks, etc. And she had an account which had just a much smaller amount of money, but she did not know that I had moved over all the other money. And so as a result, between the two of us, we were able to take care of that and watch over that. From a situation that there was an individual who had a similar situation with his mother. And so again, this is somebody who was over 50 who came up with this idea and did an app to in fact be able to make sure and to see how much was being spent, how many checks she was writing each day, et cetera, et cetera. So to in fact be able to monitor what was going on from a distance. Again, sort of an innovative thing, and how did this come about, and how do we look at what the needs are, or the wants? Look at what's happening in your own personal life. What are your pain points? Another pain point is, again, student loans. I mean, older people have more student loans outstanding than you could imagine. The majority of them are because they signed for kids and grandkids, and now it's coming home to roost. And then just one final thing, and that is that our research shows that the number one thing that 50 plus people want to do is travel and have fun. And they look at spoiling their grandchildren as their right and their obligation.
Fantastic.
So using that as the kickoff point.
So Andrew, you're a professor at the London Business School, and you're looking at this from an economic point of view in large part. The fact of the matter is that as the population ages, the ability to pay pensions, to pay for the upkeep, so to speak, of the older cohort is diminishing. Does that mean that people will have to stay in the workforce longer, whether they like it or not, even if they want to retire and have fun and travel? And what are the implications for financial services companies? Because one of the obvious things is that the insurance industry is going to be disrupted in a negative way by a very, very long-lived population. Could you just give us a flavour for what you're seeing out there in that area?
Yeah, sure. And if you don't mind, I'll answer the question and then do a very British thing and tell you that there's another question which is even better. So yeah, every economist will look at this as we have an aging population and we can't afford our pensions. And absolutely, one of the best ways of solving that problem is to have people work for longer. Every extra year of work is one less year of pension and one more year of saving. And so that's an obvious solution. And one of the things that we play around with in the book, though, is that's kind of looking at it the wrong way. So this is why I want to try and just sort of put a slightly different spin on our conversation. So I think you've got to separate out having more old people, aging, and longevity. And because of the size of the baby boomer cohort, we know we're going to have a lot more old people. But actually longevity is so much more than aging. In fact, I think we should try and disentangle it, because in a way, longevity, the increase in longevity, is the opposite of aging. If you look at mortality rates, it really is true that 70 is the new 60, 80 is the new 70. In other words, we are aging more slowly. And what longevity has is not just implications for those who are old, but for all of life. We are going to redesign time completely. And that has huge implications for our financial sector, because in the 20th century, we saw the creation of our use of time. You began by talking about the science of longevity. I think the science of longevity is, although still in its infancy, well ahead of the social science of how we respond to longevity. The 20th century saw the creation of teenagers, a whole new stage of life, a whole new market for people to approach. Before the 20th century, we had children and adults. It saw the creation of retirees, pensions, and the whole pension system. And the pension system was invented to transfer money from that second stage of life, the first being education, the second being work, the third being retirement, into the third stage. Now, if you look at what's happening with longevity trends, it's affecting everyone. Those in the room who are 45, you're probably working to your 75. Depressing thought. You've got more years to come than you've worked already. And in the 20th century, we thought we'd retire at 60. That's probably not going to be a model. If you're 20, you're going to probably work into your 75 or 80. You have a 60-year career. You're going to do things very, very differently. And we can see all sorts of really interesting changes, which I think are actually linked across the generations. So for instance, marriage. Average age at which an American gets married in 1965 was 21, now it's more like 30. The fastest growing age group for divorce in the UK, anyone know what it is?
60s.
80s. It's starting from a very, very low base, admittedly, but it's growing very, very rapidly. Now, we are going to have to rethink our markers of time in a very dramatic way. Now, you asked me, that has huge implications for everything, for work, how we structure our career, for education. You're not going to be able to get through life with an education you finished at 21 if you're working until 75. So we're going to have to think of undergraduates being 20, 40, or 60. So the age labels drop out. There's a lot of commonality. But in terms of the financial sector, certainly the idea that all of life is about working, accumulating wealth, and then paying for a pension, that's going to be very old-fashioned thinking. We're going to have very different financial needs. 20-year-olds have much less need of a mortgage or a loan for a car than they used to. And those sorts of changes are going to be massive. And then, of course, the insurance industry, there is a whole new risk around, which is exactly how long will I live for? Because it could be anywhere between 80 and 140, given your introduction. And also, of course, there's a new risk, which society's never really had before, which is I get incapacitated at 50, but I live to 100. That's not something we've ever had to deal with before. That's a big new risk. And whenever I talk about aging, most people immediately get very pessimistic. It surprises me because the data says, on average, we're all living for longer and we're healthier for longer. Everyone goes, they're depressed by it. But that's because they had this risk factor. I don't want to get Alzheimer's at 50. So if we can deal with that really big risk, there's a massive financial opportunity. But it's a different set of risks, a different structure of time, and a different approach. And all the old demographic markers, I think, aren't relevant anymore.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
So to add to what Andrew's saying, I think we're seeing that in the population. And at Airbnb, we're seeing it in two different ways. Number one is there's a growing number of people who we call the digital nomads, the global nomads, who have a point of view that they can actually mix their work and their pleasure, and they can go spend 3 months in Baja, and then 3 months in Bali, and then 3 months in Boston, and 3 months in Austin, and that's a year. And because they've got a mobile device, a laptop, and a Wi-Fi connection, and they've got co-working spaces in all those places, that's their life. And they don't need a car, and they don't need a home, and they live on Airbnb. But that's not just young people. There's a couple from Seattle, Michael and Debbie Campbell, who've been living on Airbnb now for over 1,000 days in over 50 countries. He's 71, she's 62, and they know they're going to come back to Seattle and actually start working again. But their point of view was their gap year, or in this case, gap 3 or 4 years, has been later in life. And because there is this thing called Airbnb now that allows people to live in each other's homes and stay for a week to 3 months in someone's home really easily, which is better than necessarily a hotel product for them, that happens. So I think the idea that people are interspersing their life with experiences has something to do with the fact that we're going to live longer. I think it has something to do with just the Armageddon kind of or apocalyptic mentality we might have as well, as like, I don't want to wait till 25, 30 years from now. I don't know if we're going to be still here. And so I think that in many ways, products that allow people to accelerate their opportunity to experience something that that was a bucket list 25 years from now that they can do today, I think are products that are going to work across all generations.
Great. Now, I know you want to comment here, Joe, but I want to ask you a question, actually, which is, I went to a breakfast. Bill Gates was in London recently, and I listened to him talk. And he, like everyone else, realizes that automation is putting people out of jobs in certain categories. Typically, it's the people who earn about $20 an hour who are most at risk, because they're the most automatable and economically viable jobs to automate. And that's going to be a very large part of the population. So we're talking about how people will carry on working much longer, and they'll go back to your friends from Seattle, or go back to work when they're at the age of 72. Or what's to say there are actually going to be jobs for them? Do you see jobs being created in the age of automation that will satisfy the needs of older people?
Well, and I think this is not just a discussion about older people. I agree with Andrew. We've got to redefine this in many cases about longevity, which is, yes, we are going to be working 40, 50, 60 years, maybe more. But no one said, by the way, you're going to be working 30, 40, 50, 60 years in the same career. No, this is graduation season. I'd like to tell you that my graduate students, my undergraduate students who are going to be graduating, are not going to have 1 or 2 or 3 jobs. they're going to have 3 or 4 or 5 different careers. And yes, automation is truly disrupting everyone that's in this room and not in this room, no matter what your profession is. I mean, financial advisors have a 0.58 chance of being automated in the next 10 years, according to a study done at Oxford. But one of the things we haven't noted, there are entirely new jobs that we had never heard of before. Who ever heard of Airbnb 10 years ago? By the way, a data scientist, where did that come from? A Zumba instructor. No, basically what I'm saying is that there are new professions, new technologies that are eroding yesterday's models, but there are new businesses emerging. And while we're talking to a primarily financial services audience, one of the things I want you to hear what Andrew was saying and what we're doing in the lab is that there is no business yet that owns longevity. We have profoundly medicalized aging and longevity to be a medical issue. We have retirement planning, but who's the company out there that's going to help me chart my life from 0 to age 100 and beyond?
Like
How many
Waze does.
Yeah, like Waze. Where do I go to school? How many times will you go back to school just to stay competitive, let alone to change careers?
Yeah, but
this is a new opportunity.
I want to challenge you on this because although I'm an optimist like you are, a lot of the new job creation is in the so-called gig economy. All right, now Airbnb is not the gig economy, but there is a very famous large gig economy company which doesn't have the same possibly social skills that Airbnb does, and we know which one it is, right? And those jobs are primarily for young, footloose people, and that's where the bulk of jobs are being created at the moment, as well as in the caregiving sector. Now, those are not really jobs for older people, are they? You can't see us going around on a bicycle delivering pizzas, for instance. So what are going to be the jobs what are the jobs you think?
Actually, that company, I think Joan may have an answer.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting there and thinking that, in reality, right now, about 40% of employers say they cannot find the people they need to staff jobs. And when you look at some of those areas, and just think about robots are now doing caregiving.
Yeah.
So we still have the need for people. And part of it is the mindset, because you still cannot, even though eventually maybe our whole minds will be controlled by computers, that's not in my immediate future nor anybody else's around here. So you start looking at, again, and this gets to intergenerational workforces. The older individual is part of that great teamwork that helps bring that knowledge, and I would call it the knowledge and the experience, and knowledge and experience together I would refer to as wisdom, that younger people may not yet have. So by bringing those workforces together, employers have discovered that they're much more productive, particularly on complex issues and on creative issues. Those kinds of things that you now think about, those solutions, that you then go and build some technology to help it actually come together.
Yeah, and AARP is a very good advocate for exactly that, and I think it's fantastic. Now, Andrew, you've got something to say on this as well.
Yeah, and the standard economic story, and I think it's been borne out by history, is we can always see the jobs technology is going to destroy, but not the jobs that technology will create. But there's a very nasty transition in between where people have to reskill and relearn. And clearly, as life elongates, and if technology is speeding up, we're all going to have to go through transitions to re-educate and recreate. There is a massive market out there for education throughout all of life, and I'm not sure it'll be universities necessarily who will pick up that market. So there's these
who will pick up that?
Well, I mean, there's obviously, you look at the market for MOOCs, it's mainly older people taking MOOCs, which I think is very interesting. But there's a whole bunch of new products which may not be the university degrees, but new skills and new ways. But I also think, if we look at particularly robots, perhaps they're coming just at the right time, because if you look at, there's a nice MIT study actually, Darren Asimoglu and a co-author. You look across countries in the world, Japan and South Korea have been the most advanced in adopting robots, and their growth has held up much better, because actually robots will make it easier to be physically active at work in demanding physical jobs. And of course, the other thing we're told time and time again is that, as people get older, their numerical skills, etc., starts to decline, which is a bit depressing being a mathematical economics professor. But what doesn't decline is sort of social interactions and skills, and that's the thing we're told time and time again, that artificial intelligence is going to make more and more valuable. So I do think there's loads of reasons to worry about how society responds to technology. I actually think it's probably good for older people. I think it's going to be the low-skilled and the young who it's going to be a massive problem for.
In fact, the new premium is going to be personal. If you think about being able to spend time with your doctor to talk to them, the financial advisor may be replaced by robo, but having that one-on-one conversation is going to be very important. Bank of America's retail commercial bank head just was quoted today, is talking about how the millennials are now thinking about housing. You know what he said? They need to talk, they want to talk to somebody about it. This was the generation we thought that was going to be in 100% digerati. Well, as soon as those decisions start to become more complex, emotional, and requiring engagement, guess what? Older workers are really good at, yeah, I've been there. How can I talk to you about this?
Same with travel agents. Fascinating statistic that is shocking. Younger people are using travel agents more than older people. And it's partly because they don't have the experience and knowledge of places to go, and they're looking for that personalized travel agent experience of the wisdom that comes from that.
Well, let's talk about exactly that. So is there a intergenerational conflict emerging of a serious nature, and given that young people today literally can't afford to buy houses, and that's in the US and in the United Kingdom, and that on average they're spending, I don't know what it is here, for instance, in LA, but in London it's 50% of their income's on rental, and they're really scraping a living, much worse than when we were younger. And they're saddled with student debt, something that we never had in the UK in the 1980s and 1990s. You didn't borrow money to go to university. Is there the potential for some genuine intergenerational conflict, or would it just get resolved by, life moving on? What do you think, Joe?
I don't see a conflict. I see it as a societal problem that is spanning all the generations. As Joan mentioned, there are a lot of grandparents out there that are carrying that student debt as well. Yeah. I also think it's incumbent on the education enterprise and society in general to start to rethink about what the nature of education is. So not just having it across the lifespan, but taking a student loan out for a program that might be very exciting to learn about and whatnot, that doesn't end up in a job at the other end, is problematic. We have the most educated workforce in history if you count degrees alone. But Manpower and others have done countless surveys that say around the world we can't find the talent we need, they don't have the emotional skills that we need, and they can't relate to clients. So yes, there's debt problems out there, but we've allowed people to get educated but not trained.
Right, very, very good. So, Joan, you talked about this earlier, which is that, in the United States, as in other countries, immigration is being clamped down, I think is the best way of putting it. And while it is true that, older people are adept in the workforce and should be embraced by the workforce, it's also true that every country needs an injection of youth and enthusiasm and so forth that only younger people can do. And in the United States, you're cutting that supply off really with immigration, as indeed we possibly are doing in the United Kingdom. What would you do about that?
Well, I think there are two issues. There's the low fertility rate, and people are not replacing themselves like they did, 50 years ago. That and some of the changing of the immigration, there are not as many people in that workforce. So in fact, it is very incumbent that we look to the older individual to fill that workforce. I won't get into the political issues of what we ought to do, but again, it's a recognition that we need workers, and until you can get that pipeline going, we are going to continue to have the issue of how do we get the right people trained for the right positions. And I would say it may come back to very much so, and this goes to Joe's point, we have a lot of people with a lot of degrees. I have a lot of degrees, and I'm not sure that,
Can you give me one of yours?
Can I give you one of mine? For a price? Yeah.
No, we are. That's the
that'll help
marketplace.
it. That's part of the market, selling your degrees. Anyway, but it may come back to what happened quite a few years ago. The employer corporations took a big part in training their staff. And why were they good at training their staff? Because they knew what it required in that particular in that industry. And while the training may have included some very specific industry knowledge, it also included those things that we were talking about: how to get along with people, how do you manage, how do you have customer experience.
So-called soft skills.
The soft skills that are transferable. So it may very well be that that employers do need to come back and think, what is the best for me, and how do I get the best workforce, and therefore I need to take back that training.
And this is also a societal issue too, in terms of where do we aim the workforce. You know, we need more engineers, we need more technologists. Yes, we do, but a lot of the ones we're training, they're going into doing app development, which has got its own set of fun, but yet I can't find a single engineer to build a power plant. I can't find an engineer to actually redo a hospital.
That's why immigration is important, because you can pick and choose the people that you want to fill the unfilled positions by bringing in immigrants.
And also train the folks that we have in the workforce already to be value add for the next generation.
Yeah, let me just give one example here of a country which has never really allowed immigration, which is Japan. And they have a very low fertility rate, and it's 1.2, I think, of children.
And they're the ones with the robots for caregiving.
They do, but let's look at their demographics. All right, so at the moment, the Japanese population is slightly over 120 million people. By the year 2100, which, given that we're all going to live a very long life, is not that far away, the population will be down to 50 million people. So the demographic impact of fertility, which is what you said, is absolutely enormous if projected a long time hence, which is why I think that immigration is very important to the United States and to the UK, notwithstanding the fact that I'm a Brexiteer and all that. What do you think about that in terms of, you know, the infusion of new blood into society through immigration, or the encouragement of possibly higher fertility?
Well, I'm the other 48%. I was a Remainer, so that's
why you're sitting far away from me.
Exactly.
Oh, right.
Exactly.
And I'm right in the middle here.
But you know, I think look at the big picture. If society is going to make it harder to have immigration, then obviously people become more valuable, and so you're going to use older workers more. I think if you look around, particularly if we are seeing the rise of this new technology, artificial intelligence, what's become more and more important is innovation and new ideas. And there's a presumption that comes from younger people. Although, you know, one of the things is as life elongates, we're going to get people changing their life more. And as people go through changes and transitions, they become more innovative. So actually, I wouldn't rule out older people being more innovative as well as having the wisdom. And I think, you know, one of the things that I'm very interested in is if we live for longer, what happens if the generations intermingle more? I mean, imagine if Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were all alive at the same time. I mean, surely that would be a very good thing for innovation. And we are seeing the rate of innovation slow down. Study after study says we're running out of ideas. And I can't help but think in the 20th century, the three-stage life we created of education, work, retirement meant that inevitably by the end of a 30, 35-year career, your education was running out, your new ideas running out, because you hadn't had to go through changes and transitions. And it's unlocking that potential that I think is the task for the 21st century.
Let's talk about health, okay? Because, you know, people don't want to talk about aging, and they don't want to talk about death because they regard it as being the trap of Tithonus, that you end up in a miserable sort of nursing home with dribbling on your chair and all that sort of stuff. And at the moment, I think 90% of US healthcare expenditure takes place in the last 2 years.
That vision and framing is the biggest reason why there's not a single person in this room investing in the future of a positive old age.
Well, that's not true. We are investing.
No, you're investing in health as an aging an issue. No one is investing in transportation, housing, fun, dating, the other part of what I'm going to do with those decades.
That's a very good point. But let's get real here, that $1 in $5 in the United States is spent on healthcare. Most of it is spent futilely, I think, in a futile fashion to keep people alive in their last 2 years, and not necessarily in a great way. If that money could be displaced, it could be building roads, providing education, it could be providing social services and caring and so forth. And so surely it's very important to find a way of both improving the healthcare systems, both of the UK and of the United States, but particularly here, because it seems to me to be very, very dysfunctional, and we're sort of semi-dysfunctional in the United Kingdom. And to keep people in a welderly as opposed to an elderly state in the latter part of their lives. And I think it's an important discussion about this, because the opportunities economically in that area are very, very large indeed. And if you can get healthcare expenditure down to 10% of GDP, it also means that growth in other parts of the economy will be much more substantial. What do you think about that, Chip? Or is that just a statement of the obvious, basically?
Yeah, I think it is. I think certainly that's what we'd like. I think the real question here is the question of nudge, the book that came out a few years ago. In terms of, we know what helps us stay healthy. The question is, how do we use government or not use government as a means of helping to create a welderly population? And I think the direction that we're seeing right now, at least in this country, is a direction away from nudge, meaning away from the intelligentsia. The government knows better, and we're going to help you have a better life as a result. So I think.
But should that be the case? I mean, sugar, we all know, is an absolute killer. It's one of the main reasons that people get diabetes and all the comorbidities that go along with it. And yet, outside here in the Milken Institute, there's piles of cinnamon buns and muffins.
They were
and
good too.
Yeah, well, that's the point. So we all know that we need to moderate our behaviour, as you say. So shouldn't the government be intervening in the same way as they intervened in the tobacco industry, which is basically to put huge taxes on providers of bad food and sugary products, basically? Would any one of you agree with that?
I want to take a different tact, and that's
Right.
the incentive side. And we think about products and services. So I have an Apple Watch, and my grandson, who's 8.5, just absolutely loves it. So whenever I'm around him, we have to go out on these treks so he can see how much we're walking and running, etc. So after we've been 5 miles, I'm thinking, Connor, can't we go home? But no, we haven't done our 6 miles. Those are the kinds of products and services, just like Fitbits, that really get people thinking, I can do this. It's like when I'm driving in my car and my watch says time to stand up. I'm thinking, well, this is a little unrealistic now, but it keeps making me think about that.
When you've got an autonomous vehicle, you'll be able to do that.
That's true.
Very soon. Andrew, what you want to
Yeah, I mean, I think as everyone I think is pointing out here, there's sort of health and medical expenditure, and of course, if you want to look at the US and the level of expenditure it's got and the outcomes it's getting, there's a lot of work to be done. Because while we're talking here about life expectancy increasing, it has of course fallen the last couple of years in the United States because best practice is not being pursued. So there's a lot of issues there. But I do think we're looking at business opportunities. We should think more about the leisure industry more broadly. And in writing the book, The 100-Year Life, this is all about time and what use we make of time. So I read a huge amount about the social history of leisure, which was absolutely quite fascinating. And of course, you see at the end of the 19th century, the creation of a recreation industry, the big sports, the cinemas, the music halls. Because with the invention of the factory, you invented work, and so you invented leisure. So we had the growth of a leisure industry. Just look at the word recreation. It's really recreation. We invented the weekend because we were so exhausted after working 12-hour days, we needed a break. And what we're going to have over this long life is periods of recreation, where I'm investing in my health, my relationships, my education, and my skills. And that is health very broadly perceived. And that to me seems an enormous opportunity. Airbnb, you were talking about this as a gap year age 70. Absolutely. Yoga, gym, they're all part of it, but there will be a whole bunch of products as well. Wearable technology, fabrics that measure your heart rate, etc. This is going to be an enormous element of health, which is about personal choice rather than government provision. That, of course, will open up a massive inequality because those with the resources and education will make the right choices, and we're going to even more of a bigger gap than we have right now.
So we have to invest a lot in education at an early stage for everyone. Otherwise, there is going to be an even wider inequality in countries such as the UK and the United States, right?
I think the gap between the top 10% and bottom 10% in the US is 15 years of life expectancy, I think. And now that's a really big policy challenge because if you've got income inequality, you can take money from the rich and give it to the poor and say you're narrowing it, but I can't take years of life from the rich and give it to the poor. Yeah. So somehow it's got to be something around education, but I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that. Well, and it may well be this is where this new technology comes in.
And also the taxes I mentioned earlier, which I'm a big advocate of. So Chip, everyone's talking about how in a career you're going to have, in your career, you're going to have 4, 5, 6 different jobs, all right? But one of the features that many people find comforting in life is that they stay with one company and they know all the people in the company. And if you were perpetually moving from one company to another, does that not cause a sort of sense of isolation, of nomadism, which is not really consistent with human beings' values? I mean, how are we going to move from Airbnb to Google to whatever on a continuous basis and not feel that we're not really embraced by a sense of community?
People, long ago it was said that people join a company and they leave their boss. And I think that's true. I think that the connection you make with the people within your team and your boss is more important over time than the reputation of the company overall. But you can recreate that, to use the word recreate. You can recreate that in other environments. Do people appreciate the comfort? Yes, but that leads to complacency and apathy as well, in terms of people actually not feeling the sense of renewal that can come from being in a new environment. I mean, I'll just speak for myself personally for a moment. I was CEO of my own company, 3,500 employees for 24 years. I wasn't planning on going back I was going to retire at age 52. And so when the founders approached me, Airbnb approached me and said, join, I liked the idea. They were talking about democratizing hospitality, which sounded very noble. But I didn't realize in my first meeting, sitting with a bunch of engineers, the first day, an engineer looked at me with 20 of us in the room and he said, if you shipped a feature and nobody used it, did it really ship? And it's like, wow, well, I took philosophy, but I did not take computer science, so I have no idea what shipping a feature means. And I had to basically out myself as an idiot, which was a beautiful experience because it made me realize quite in that moment in my first week at Airbnb that I needed to recreate myself. And
so did you take a course or did you go on a...
No, I didn't take it, but this is what I want to do next, is to help create a world where people after 50 can recreate themselves and be a mentor and an intern at the same time.
So when we come to the conclusion about what we should be investing in this area for the longevity dividend, it seems that education is a recurring theme. But is it possible to invest in education? Are there opportunities to really make money out of education? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
There are certainly for-profit
Yes.
online courses and the like, but we can...
Well, do they actually make a profit? That's the point.
So far, a few of them are doing quite well, and you
Yeah.
can see the universities trying to play catch-up. But before we even create that, we also have to have a changing of the social contract. If you are going to be living 100 years, the new expectation is to be learning for a lifetime. That will create the market for these for-profits. If you're going to be living for 100 years, the idea of working for one company, even with the current generation, the folks that are either gigsters or working in work bars and the like, they've given up that notion, I'm going to be with the same institution for a long time. So it's creating the market, but it's also a new expectation, not just for society and government, but for all of us individually.
And the trajectory of life is changing for really everyone. And one of the interesting things that my business partner Greg and myself have identified is an opportunity to invest in the restoration of fertility in postmenopausal women, which will change so much in society. I mean, talking about changing the social contract, but if that could be done, and I think, Joan, you thought that was a very interesting area, that would really...
I was, it would be nice if you could get the men to be carrying the baby.
Well, okay, well, there we go, right, yeah.
Now that's an innovation I could really get behind.
Yeah, well,
See that job, don't want it.
but so there are so many things that are going to have to change in our mindsets. And how do we get that message across, apart from you writing a book and me writing a book and you representing a country the size of Spain as the president, la presidenta. Yeah. How do we get that message across to the general population that don't regard your life as being a fixed imperative similar to your grandparents, that it's absolutely fundamentally changing and it's changing now. So how would you do that?
One of the things I think we need to be cognizant of is that we often talk about age in a derogatory standpoint. So I think we need to have a little unconscious, we recognize that we often say things that are joking or self-deprecating. And when you do that in a group, that starts to be carrying through as being acceptable. It reinforces it. So we need to stop thinking about, wow, you don't look like you're 70, you don't look like you're 80, or can I help you open the door because you look a little too old to do that. I know when I go to the grocery store and they offer to take things out to my car, I will say to them, is that because I look like I need help or you just want to get some fresh air? And
I wonder what your board
those
meetings
kinds
are
of
like.
things. Yeah. So those are the kind of things we need to think about. And
Yeah.
that will get the discussion started and the recognition that there is a different way to think about
Now,
it.
you make a very good point that, calling aging a disease is possibly not the right thing to do, but we do have to start thinking that the root cause of many of the diseases that kill the people in this world, and 160,000 people die every day, by the way, on the planet, and 100,000 of them die from the diseases of aging, which is an interesting stat. And those diseases of aging have a unified underlying cause, which is the fact that we get older. So we need to find some way in presenting that so that the money flows into research into the fundamental basis of aging. Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Absolutely, and I think to me there's two challenges here. One is on the demand side. As you've heard, this is a $15 trillion market. Then the other is on the supply side, how we get people to be productive for longer. Because by the way, that will create more than $15 trillion of output. So on both of them, these are very big numbers. I think from my point of view, there's two questions to ask is, why should firms do anything about it? And what should they do about it? In terms of the demand side, it's obvious why firms should do something about it. There's a huge market. It's going to evolve. I mentioned teenagers earlier. It took about 80 years to sort of firm up the concept of teenagers. So there's a huge experimentation to happen, but it will happen. I think the harder thing for the consumer side is, what should people do? Because there's a raft of potential markets, but what are the products that we need to invent? So it's hard. On the supply side, I think the challenge is, why should firms do anything about it? Because at the moment, everything's going shorter and shorter and shorter, younger and younger and younger. So the focus on innovation and productivity is key. But what they should do is very obvious. We need to revamp recruitment, we need to change the concept of retirement and provide a much more flexible working career where people have on and off periods within the same organisation.
Yeah, we have to do that. It's not we need to do it. We just have to do that.
I think
We've got 4 minutes left, so what I'm going to suggest is that each of the participants, the 4 people here, has 1 minute to kind of convey a key message, one thing that they would like to convey at the end of the talk to the audience, if you wouldn't mind, starting with you, Chip.
So I'll segue with what Andrew said, because I think the idea of productivity needs to be revamped. We still have a widget era mentality of productivity, such that the math we do in companies is to say, how many widgets did you create, in what period of time, for what cost? And the truth is, and there's a lot of data on this now, older workers have a productivity dividend, create a productivity dividend to the teams that they're involved in. My experience at Airbnb is a good example of that, but I think there's a lot of examples at mid-level in organizations that aren't getting enough attention. And I think once more of this data is brought out, and there's a sense of there's an intergenerational transfer of wisdom that can go in both directions, from young to old and from old to young, we will create a workforce that actually embraces longevity.
Right, very good. 1 minute, Joe.
There's a new generation gap. The generation gap is not about old and young, it's about expectations. I don't think any of us in this room have the same expectation for old age that our parents did, nor are we necessarily as polite. We expect a pill, a policy, or a product to help us not just live longer, that's only half the market, but to live better. The new endless frontier is to live longer, better, and to create new stories and products and services and indeed policies to help us do that for at least 100 plus years.
President Joan.
I think we need to think about this as a very complex ecosystem. And we can't think of it in silos, because we need to think about how everything fits together, the employment situation, the longevity, the science, the health, because in effect, perhaps because we have looked at it in silos is one of the reasons we are where we are today. We have people living to potentially 120, 130, and yet we have not figured out how to make it a engaging life through that period of time.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, Andrew, can you wrap it up for us?
Yeah, so first of all, this is the biggest social change that's going to change everything in the next 50, 60 years. There are trillions of dollars to be made. That's unquestionably the case. If you want to make money, though, I think you've got to avoid the tyranny of numbers, by which I mean, because we're living for longer and changing how we shape our life, don't think that you know what 20 means as an age anymore. Don't think you know what 40 means, or 60 or 70. And that's a mistake everyone makes, a sort of nominal determinism. This number tells me your incentives. we're recreating life, we have to recreate products. And if I can just finish with one example of this. In the UK, there's a nightclub called Fabric, and there was a big story in the papers because this 80-year-old couple were visiting their son in London, and they went to Fabric, and this was, all the newspapers, 80-year-olds going to a nightclub. And because of the book, a number of journalists phoned me, and I said, well, of course, I mean, if you like going out, it's fun to watch young people and to be in a place that's vibrant. I said, it's even weirder that 20-year-olds pay to watch the Rolling Stones with an average age of 71 dance live on stage. Forget about the numbers. It's just people doing things, and that's the way to we're creating a new life.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, panelists, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening.